Hey friends, welcome back to our channel. As you've seen in thumbnail, in this video we are gonna see, what if Deku raised by mysterious family to awaken ancient quirk? This is part 1, and if you want more than Pellis, make sure to leave comment, hit that like button and subscribe. That help me to upload more of this video. And also I request to check out the author of this story, Glowing Eyes MHA by StarDuskk. Do check out. Now let's dive into video. His breath hitched, throat dry, and his bones felt sore. He glanced up at the green-haired older man before him, sweat clouding his vision and the exhaustion making it go blurry. "Is that all you got?" A voice bellowed, ringing in his ears. They had been at it for hours. With every advance he made, he was forced back twice as much. He coughed, spitting blood from his mouth and forcing himself into position once again, lowering his center, shifting his feet and raising his fists. A deep breath, forcing the oxygen to pump through his veins and forcing the screaming of his muscles to the back of his head. One breath, two breaths, and charge. Izuku was met with brutal punches, each and every he tried to avoid and dodge. Each hit was more violent than the previous, each holding more frustration as the hits missed or got blocked by the smaller boy. Izuku kept his feet light, his body soft, and made sure to harden himself when he blocked. With each punch or kick that came his way, he shifted his center, his muscles and his breath to better lower the impact or completely change its course. He could hear in the older man's breath how he was getting impatient and annoyed. The more annoyed he got, the more predictable the older man's moves got, and the harder they got. Izuku could basically feel each and every intent the man before him held in his hits, with each having the intent to hurt. Izuku kept dodging, letting the fight drag out and the older man getting more and more predictable and tired with it. Soon, Izuku took a deep breath, kicking off from the danger zone to give himself just a fraction more time. He lowered his gravity center, centering his core, and kicked off the ground. His kick landed against a firm and well-prepared block, as he immediately got spun around by the older man and once again landed on the floor. The air left his lungs at the impact and his vision flickered with white dots dancing in his view. The boy gasped for air, the pain rushing through his spine and spreading to the rest of his body. Izuku stayed down, his legs refusing the order he was giving them, his arms too weak to fully lift him up. The bitter taste of bile was building up in his mouth and he tried to force it down, body shaking from exhaustion. But the boy could feel how the bile got more intense, as he couldn't keep his food down and colored the concrete floor with his lunch. "TSK, once you are finished with that disgusting behavior, run 5 rounds around the building. After that you get to eat. Maybe you can keep that down." Izuku could only nod absent-mindedly, ignoring the judgmental voice and disgust it held, only hearing the heavy steps of his father leave the hall. Izuku felt the disgusting taste of bile on his lips, his arms still shaking as he pushed himself to the side, careful not to land in what was previously known as his lunch. He heaved in breath after breath, trying to supply his muscle and body with enough oxygen to finally calm down. The green-haired boy closed his eyes, trying to calm his aching bones and raising mind. At 4 years old, he had been cursed with being quirkless. At 4 years old, his father had woken him up in bed and with an urgent voice told him they were leaving. At 4 years old, he was forced to leave his home and everything he knew. At 4 years old, he had to leave his mom. Izuku choked at the thought, forcing his shaking legs up and out the training hall. Father's POV then. Hisashi was shaking in rage when his wife came home that day, telling him his successor was quirkless. He refused to acknowledge that his own flesh and blood could be so weak. His beautiful wife, her quirk slightly on the weaker side but with so much potential, would have made the perfect child. Yet the child didn't even get a fucking quirk. Deep breaths. Deep breaths. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I'm so very sorry," he whispered as he held his wife in his arms, giving her the comfort and calm he believed she desperately sought for. He tried to calm his own raging anger, reminding himself this wasn't the place. He couldn't let his fragile wife see him in that state. The small sound of sobs escaped the smaller women, a consistent yet incoherent mumbling beginning to form in his chest. She was overthinking again, Hisashi concluded. He stroked his wife's hair in an attempt to further calm her, careful not to burn her beautiful green hair. A pair of emerald green eyes poked out behind the corner, almost glowing in the dim light of the hallway. Hisashi ignored the boy, tried to ignore the child of his own flesh and blood. For his own blood only started to boil when he looked at the boy. Instead, he simply focused on his wife, snuggling down in the crack of her neck and ignoring the embodiment of a disappointment that stood staring at them. He would deal with that thing later. His son was barely visible that evening, much to Hisashi's delight, but much less to his own wife's delight. "I don't know what to do, Hisashi. He won't eat or even leave his room. He seems so broken." Hisashi simply nodded, about to say something about how it's a shame. Though he had a slight idea that his wife would believe the situation was a shame, not the fact that her son was a shame like how he would have meant it. Just as the words were about to slip out of his lips, his phone rang high, vibrating on the table beside him. He simply gave his wife an apologetic look and went to take it, leaving for their balcony and closing the door shut behind him. The called ID left the blood cold in his veins, and Hisashi took a deep shaking breath before pressing the green button to accept the call. Hisashi, the voice ringing cold on the other side of the line. "Father," he answered in an equally cold tone, a slight waver in his voice. "I heard of your son," Hisashi cursed under his breath. He hadn't even had time to come up with some sort of excuse yet. He knew his father would find out eventually, but he didn't think it would take him that little time. Guess his father's influence was still great in the world. "What's about it?" The venom in his voice dripped warm. "Come home and bring the boy. Simple and order." "Why?" "Your son might be quirkless, but not useless from what I know. I need to see the boy myself before I give that assessment." The phone call rang short, leaving the beeping sound of a call ended in Hisashi's ear. The phone felt warm in his fists, slowly turning into molten liquid of what had once been a fully functioning device. Hisashi roared and slammed his fists against the railing, birds scattering somewhere in the distance, sparks flying across the railing, and it slowly turned a blistering orange color. The dark summer evening felt cool against his skin, and without another word he walked back inside. His wife already gone to sleep and a plan quickly forming in his head. The next day Inko would wake up, with both her precious son and lovable husband gone. The only evidence of the night before would be the bent handprint on the metal railing. Izuku now. Izuku forced his legs forward as he ran the last loop around the huge building, his breath barely able to give his muscles enough oxygen to continue. His still small legs and body weren't cut out for this, but it had been forced to adapt to it. Hours of long training and brutal beatings had shaped the small boy into something else, something broken. As he finally reached the last steps of his run, he collapsed on the ground, feeling the sheer exhaustion that was screaming in his body. He let his breath catch up, trying to calm his beating heart. For a moment he simply stayed there, staring up at the ever-growing darkening sky. Small dots of light scattered across the endless sky. A moon in a crescent shape shining its reflective light at the world beyond. Izuku reached his hand for the sky, clenching as if he could reach the stars beyond. "Your freckles look like stars. My dearest Izuku." The faint memory of his mother flickered through his mind and disappeared. Only her words were still clear in his clouded mind. 8 years was a long time not to see one's own mother. 8 long years made you forget about certain things about them. At first it was only details, and soon it became bigger things you never wanted to forget. Their smile, their smell, their favorite food or color, their looks. If Izuku hadn't been told he got the eyes from his mom, he wouldn't even remember the color of her eyes. It felt like a lifetime ago, which in a way it was for the boy. Izuku could feel the soft breeze of the night ruffle his hair, the sky above slowly calm his mind, yet also making the longing far worse. The stars had each other. The stars even had the moon to keep them company. The leaves on the branches had one another. The flowers had its petals and bees. The birds even had their own families. So why was he so alone? Only the rustle of the leaves answered his thoughts, leaving him feeling no better. Izuku laid there for a minute, breathing in the chilly summer evening air. He let his mind be filled with whatever was around him, trying to calm the anxiety and panic in his blood. It was a good way, he had realized years ago, that wouldn't leave him completely defenseless but still allowing him to relax. So he let himself feel the soft grass tickling his skin and the wind caress him. He let himself smell the damp soil, the fresh grass and the sweet flowers. He let himself taste the crisp mountain air. He let himself hear the rustling of the leaves, the flap of a bird nearby and the scurrying of a mouse. His muscles slowly started to loosen, his bones not aching as much and his wounds felt like they were closing and healing. And finally he let himself see. Izuku let himself see the stars, the moon. He let himself see the thousands of gradients of green in the leaves and grass, the reflection of the sky and the dozens of flowers painting the nature's floor. He saw the gradient of the sky in the summer night, the small details of the trees and nature around him slowly revealing themselves to the male. The veins in the leaves, the tree bark and the insects hiding beneath it. The amber color on the flower petals and their pollen getting picked up by the wind. And Izuku relaxed. As he laid there, the evening turned to night. Another day would pass, and soon another week, another month, and eventually year. He would grow with time, and he suddenly wondered if his mom would have told him happy birthday. If she would have given him a small cake and sung a song for him. His 12th birthday passed just a few days ago, yet no one had acknowledged it. No one had even given him a congratulation. They were all too busy with getting things ready for his departure, his intense training that would last 2.5 years. He would pretty much be left to survive by himself in one of the biggest criminal cities in the world, where law and order was a myth and dangerous quirks were everywhere. No one would bat an eye at a rotting corpse, would stop a burglary, or even try to stop someone from getting beaten to pulp. And he had to survive there and both make a living, as well as make a big enough achievement so that the entire world would turn towards that abandoned place. Hisoshi grabbed a suitcase, throwing anything he could get his hands on in a pile with no regard of whether or not it would hold beneath his rough handling. He grabbed Izuku's birth certificate, his pass, and some slightly more plain clothes. His hero merch would stand out too much. He pushed things aside, searching for things of importance that he might need. The layout of the small apartment made it easy to find things, but also treacherous. The soft sound of rustling sheets stopped Hisashi dead in his tracks, feeling his blood run cold. The sound came from his bedroom, where he and Inko would sleep together through the nights. The place his own wife was currently asleep, or was supposed to be asleep. Inko couldn't wake up. She just couldn't. How would he explain what he was doing? How could he tell her what he was planning? He tried to lower the sound of his breathing, being more afraid of the sound of his heartbeat would reach her. The minutes passed like hours, and Hisashi was far too afraid to go and check himself if the female was still asleep. Silence. Hisashi breathed out, continuing his ravaging of the small apartment, just slightly more quiet. The clock was ticking symbolically, reminding him he didn't have enough time. So he hurried. It was almost 3 in the morning when he finally managed to get everything of importance. He had burned all their pictures, removed anything that could point to them or get a visual representation of who he was. He had debated on doing the same with Izuku, but had decided to leave just a few photos of when the boy was still a baby. It would be hard to pinpoint the child with only that. He couldn't have people recognize them. Hisashi stopped for a minute, looking around the still fairly tidy apartment. From the broad windows looking over the street below, to simple lamps and the green-worn sofa. The slightly ancient TV and fresh fruit standing on the living room table. Some of the art Inko had made in her younger years hung up on the wall on display together with some now empty frames that used to hold photos of them. The dark floorboard complained lightly under his weight as he walked towards the window, the familiar view feeling somewhat comforting. He had built a life here, away from that wretched family of his. He had found a woman with both a good quirk, body and mind. He worked in a big company with all right pay, and he had hobbies and goals. He had a son with the women he loved, and things had been perfect. For a while he had been happy. With a loud tisk he treaded towards the boys' room, carefully trying to avoid the creaking floorboards and toys scattered across the floor. He cursed underneath his breath every time some toy made a squeak, or that damn phrase "I am here," or the floorboards complained under his weight. He found that he had quite the creative storage of curses when he finally reached the boys' room. Hisashi carefully opened the wooden door. The room was full with posters of heroes, specifically All Might and toys and figures displayed in an impressive amount. As he carefully sneaked forward, he could almost feel how the posters and figures judged him, tearing him down and evaluating him. He could almost hear them speak too. Taking a child like this? Is he insane? No father would remove their son from a loving mother. Is he gonna abduct his own son? You aren't a true man. No father would put their child in harm's way. How dare you do this to your own child? You are a real villain. You truly are a disappointment. Hisashi hissed at the last comment, despite the fact that the posters were hanging quietly and emotionless on the walls. He clicked his tongue and continued to the small figure that was sleeping in the bed. An overwhelming sense of disgust and hate crashed into him as a tide wave. This thing had ruined everything. If he had been born with a quirk, he could have convinced his father it was better if he trained him himself, better if he stayed here with his wife, and they could have easily made Izuku into something acceptable. Without even registering what was happening, Hisashi had reached out his hands in a cupped motion, his body ready to strangle the child and say he must have choked on something in his sleep. After all, what people would investigate a quirkless kid? Hisashi hovered over the boy for a solid minute, debating, before finally settling on waking the little child up, lightly covering his mouth so he wouldn't make any sounds. Izuku now. Izuku walked down towards the dining room. His energy depleted and bruises blossomed across his skin. He tried to stretch but could only grimace at the pain his stiff muscles could give him. He caught a look of himself in a nearby puddle, grimacing further at his horrendous state. His green locks were thoroughly looking more like a bird nest rather than actual hair. His clothes were ripped in multiple areas and burned in others. The cuts had since long started healing and once again trying to create a smooth surface, but the dried-up blood remained. Izuku tried to remove the hair from his face, only to get tangled up with his finger in the ever-growing mess. And back from the puddle stared two vibrantly green eyes. Izuku traced the lower line of his eyes with his fingers, the figure in the puddle doing the same. He wondering for a moment if his mother also had such vibrant eyes as him. Most people had very dull eyes, almost dead in Izuku's opinion. His grandfather had slightly more gleaming red eyes, and his own father had fairly dull red eyes. None of them had the vibrance of his own eyes. None of them had the emerald green shine as his own eyes portrayed. Izuku shook his head and hurried past the long garden to manage to eat some dinner before the servants removed the last of it. His steps barely made a sound against the gravel beneath him, Izuku shifting and stepping in a way that made the gravel beneath him almost stay in a still motion before he already left it behind him. He was still struggling with being truly quiet, shifting his center of gravity to the ground beneath him and blending in with the environment around him. Some tutors had shown him, told him how to do it, but there was something about the shifting his gravity, something about constantly assessing where his feet should land and how they should land that he hadn't managed to grasp yet. He reached the old Japanese-styled villa, his breath in his throat as he tried to calm his heartbeat. It was only a house, he reminded himself. He calmed his racing heart, his mind and body. He held his breath for a minute, trying to reset everything in him before allowing himself to take a deep breath again. Everything to calm himself before he had to meet his grandfather. His father had probably once again used an excuse of being too tired or having other things to do to avoid meeting his old man. Izuku didn't have that luxury. His small legs forced him up the stairs, despite the exhaustion running deep into his bones. With every step he stretched himself, dusted off the dirt or leaves from his ripped clothes or scraped away dry blood from his wounds, trying to make himself look more presentable, more acceptable. He pushed the sliding door aside and headed inside, walking in a decisive manner towards the dining room. This time his footsteps were lighter, leaving not even a single sound from the usual creaking floorboards. He treaded forward, his body all too used with the long hallways and catwalks. The boy finally reached the dining room, and with not even a single thread of hesitation he opened the sliding doors and walked inside. Izuku felt a slight shaking motion as he slowly awoke from his worried slumber. He had been twisting and turning for most of the night, hearing footsteps and the sound of crackling fire outside his door. He lost count on how many times he heard the phrase "I am here" before he finally managed to fall into a light and worried slumber. He blinked the sleep out of his big eyes, feeling a warm hand cover his mouth. Izuku looked up, seeing his father's red dull eyes stare back at him. The slight glint in them felt ominous, a dark and unfamiliar feeling making the child scared. But the boy trusted his father. Children were supposed to trust their parents after all. Once again Izuku tried to blink the obvious signs of sleep from his eyes, feeling how his body was heavy and eyelids begging to close again. Uku. Izuku. Izuku gave out a slight hum of acknowledgement before almost closing his eyes again, only to be roughly pulled out of bed. The young boy staggered to get his balance back, feeling how any indication of tiredness slipped through his grasp. Izuku, my boy, my sweet son, his father almost spat out. A smile plastered across his features. The tone felt urgent in a way, as if they didn't have time. You and I are gonna have a little adventure. So put on some nice clothes and meet me by the door in 5 minutes, okay? Izuku simply nodded, feeling that it would be bad to ask or say anything. He had no idea how to tell when it had been 5 minutes, and he didn't dare to ask either. His father simply nodded in satisfaction, leaving the green-eyed boy to go double-check his own packing. Izuku hurriedly put on some clothes, choosing one of his many All Might t-shirts and a pair of All Might trousers that he had worn the day before. Once he dressed himself in ill-matching clothes and 2 different pair of socks, he grabbed his All Might stuffy and hurried towards the front door. His steps so quiet not even a mouse would have heard him coming. The small boy glanced around the small apartment, noting how the family photos were gone. Things were not quite standing in the right place and the slight smell of fire lingered in the air. The things stood as if they had been moved and hurriedly placed back in a messy way. The unknown feeling in his gut grew, as the boy didn't know what the feeling truly meant. But it wasn't a feeling he liked, and he wanted the bad feeling to go away. Izuku continued quietly towards the front door, his eyes jumping from place to place in the small apartment. Everything felt wrong. It felt odd and out of place. Izuku didn't understand, but his father told him to hurry. He said, an adventure? Adventures are fun, and at the end of an adventure were always a treasure, and then he could give the treasure to his mom and dad. The sound of his mom's breathing made him slow down, glancing to his parents' room in slight hesitation. His small frame moved by its own, carefully treading into his parents' room and seeing his mom's peaceful body sleeping on the mattress. Beside her stood a well-made bed where his father would usually sleep. Izuku sometimes came in here when he had nightmares. The nightmares would always go away when his mother held him in his arms. His mother's body moved up and down to the motion of her breathing, her green-kind eyes hidden from his gaze. The young child stared, a longing filling his mind. So the child reached out, reaching for his mother's face, reaching for her cheek, her Izuku? Izuku? A slight loud whisper sounded from the entrance of the apartment, the frustration not even hidden anymore. Izuku retreated, looking at his mother's peaceful figure, and slipped down the hallway to the entrance before being able to touch his mother. Despite the growing pit in his stomach, he knew his mother would always be there to hold him tight and chase the bad dreams away. Hisashi POV then. Hisashi cursed under his breath, wondering where that bastard child could have ended up. Gosh, he hated small useless children. Why couldn't they just do as he said? Izuku. Aizu. A slight tug made Hisashi jump, twisting around ready to burn the intruder. Instead, glowing green eyes stared up at him and Hisashi accidentally cursed under his breath again. He hadn't even heard the kid coming, even less felt his presence or any indication he was right behind him. The boy tilted his head, letting a single word trace his lips as the sound vibrated the air. Mom? Hisashi felt his blood freeze. A simple question, one word, but yet it held so much more questions. Questions that wanted no needed answers. Hisashi bit his lip, clenching his fists to the point where red marks appeared on his palms. He needed an excuse, something that made the boy join him somewhat willingly. He glanced down at the glowing green eyes, despise filling his very core. He opened his mouth, his tongue feeling thick and clumsy as the words spilled out. You and I will go on an adventure together, to get Mom a surprise. A very thrilling surprise. Hisashi was glowing at his own genius, because he didn't actually lie. He just twisted the truth and hid some other significant details. But his proud stance quickly disappeared when the emerald eyes stared at him in something he couldn't distinguish. Something that made his confidence disappear as quickly as water disappeared in the desert sand. Those green, vibrant eyes felt like they were staring deep into his fractured soul, forcing his each and every dark secret to lay out for the world to see. Hisashi felt his breath catch in his throat, discomfort or fear building up in his gut. As if the world slowed down, and Hisashi stood frozen with it. Eventually, Izuku simply nodded in slow motion and Hisashi let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The world returned to its normal speed and the sound of ticking clocks returned. As if he could finally breathe again. And that made him furious. Hisashi grabbed the young boy, roughly dragging him out of the door and closing it behind him, locking it before melting the keys in his breath, ignoring the whimper of the boy in his other hand. Fuck this. Fuck everything. Izuku now. Izuku walked with determined steps through the door, seeing his grandfather sit by the long end of the table quietly sipping his tea. Red eyes met green ones and Izuku forced himself to remain calm. He swallowed the forming lump in his throat as he sat down across from his grandfather, an obvious chair standing abandoned between them. The servants flooded the room, carrying various different meals to suit their taste and needs. It was barely a sound as they placed down the meals, barely a clatter of cutlery as it was touching the wooden simplistic table. The servants' light steps disappeared as soon as they arrived, leaving a neatly made table as if it had always been there. The first time it happened he had stared in awe, asked questions and wondered how they did that, and even tried to ask the servants if it had something to do with a quirk or just how they managed to be so harmonized. The only thing he got in response was his grandfather's stern eyes and the servants not even sparing him a glance. He got used to it after a while though, the cold atmosphere, the lack of individual interest and smiles, the lack of the feeling of a home. His grandfather and him clapped their hands, thanking for the food before the cold silence began. The only sound that could be heard was the knives scratching against the plates and the sound of wooden sticks hitting each other. The big room held a classic Japanese decor with plants and flowers standing in the corners, beautifully decorated paper walls and simplistic and scarce decorations. The food felt tasteless in his mouth. Izuku forced another bit of chopped pork down his throat, his stomach begging for more but his throat too tight to let it down. The boy was aware he needed to eat, to consume calories and minerals to be able to perform in a good shape. But in the tense atmosphere, the cold and unemotional dinners, he had always felt suffocating. Izuku could feel red eyes piercing him, but he desperately focused on the food as if he hadn't noticed. Another spoon of rice, a piece of broccoli and carrot. His breath felt heavy in his chest. Even the longest of training sessions weren't the same as this. His grandfather's eyes drilling into his soul and tying string after string around his metaphorical bones. Look at me and order. Emotions deeply hidden and concealed behind decades of practice and leadership. The voice was laced with authority and power. Izuku forced himself to look up and felt how his eyes got locked with the elder. A far too long second floated by before the older man cracked a smile. A smile Izuku hated. "Oh, you have such wonderful eyes." Then, a child whimpered as his father was dragging him through the empty streets. The street lights flickering, trash tumbling over the abandoned streets with the wind. It was an unusually cold summer night, and an unusually abandoned summer night. As if people had forgotten to go out on just this day, leaving any unfortunate soul to their own device. A man, still fairly new to the world of heroism, was sitting on the roof, following the boy and father with his eyes. The older man seemed to be in a hurry, dragging the younger boy with him and hushing him forward. He dragged a big suitcase behind them that looked old and worn. The slight sound of its wheels dragging across the concrete roads and the sound of footsteps filled the otherwise silent area. He had seen it before, how parents were out late or missed the last train with their children trying to find a way home again or to their destination. It wasn't unusual in any way, and since the train stopped going a while back, the two were probably on a search for a cab or something. What caught the hero's attention, though, was the look of the child, the hesitant footsteps treading over the dark road, the unsure motion and constant look backwards as if he was looking for something, for someone. And the boy's eyes. The younger boy's eyes seemed to glow in a forest green color. The dark-haired hero was debating on intervening or not, but the obvious resemblance between father and son had him stop. The father might just be late home with his son, or they were late to some other place. It would explain their hurried motion and why the boy kept looking back. Maybe he missed something from where he was headed from? Yeah, that was the most logical explanation. He followed the two with his eyes, watching as they made their way past a corner and disappeared from his view. Yet, the pro-hero felt as if something was wrong. The dark-haired man shook his head, wrapping the capture weapon closely to his neck before continuing on his patrol. He was probably overthinking it, he concluded, the gnawing feeling never quite leaving his gut. It wasn't until the next morning, when a frantic green-haired woman had stepped into the police station bawling her eyes out how her son and husband were gone, how all their family photos had been burned up and given a vivid description of the two, that the pro realized he made a big mistake. Hisashi was tired, and he was even more tired at having this useless, dead-weight, worthless piece of nothing behind him, also known as his son. His father had arranged for them to be picked up, so they were now driving towards the hidden villa in the mountains where dangerous quirked animals had taken residence. Gosh, even animals was more useful than his fucking son. Izuku had been unusually quiet for the entire way through, his mumbling only slipping up once, which a stern stare had been enough to make the child shut up. He clutched his All Might plush in a death grip, refusing Aro let the ugly doll go as if his life depended on it. Not because Hisashi cared. Let the child keep his forsaken toy. As long as he didn't bother him, he was satisfied. The car ride continued in silence, the only noise coming from the engine and the wheels underneath. The driver was also quiet, sitting with a neatly ironed suit and a black hat together with tinted glasses. Hisashi huffed at it. Why would you need tinted glasses when it's already in the middle or the night? Or well, maybe not so middle anymore, considering you could see how the sun was rising and birds started with their god-awful chirping. Morning, Inko would wake up soon. She would wake up to a home without a husband or child, having no idea where the two would have disappeared off to. She would try to call, only to be met with the short explanation that the cell number she just called was no longer in use. Hisashi hadn't even left a note to explain or any trace of where they could have gone or clue to her. It was for the best. For the best. The uncomfortable lump in his throat told him otherwise, the burning feeling in his stomach and aching headache screaming differently. The best. Hisashi slammed his hand against the car door, making both the boy beside him and the driver jump. Neither of them dared to question it, though, as the man's palms were already smoking. Smoke escaped his mouth as he took a shaking deep breath to calm his rising anger. Hisashi dragged his hand over his face, feeling the sudden wave of exhaustion hit him hard. He left. And he is returning to his hell that he thought he had escaped. He had underestimated his father's power, his name and authority. The Midoriya name was known. No, it wasn't just known, it was legend. Any underground organization had in some way connection with the Midoriya family, their influence seeping into any cracks and filling it with its own poison. In a way, if the underground organization was a web, the Midoriya family would be the spider. They were informants as well as secret keepers, they were the murderers as well detectives, they were the heroes as well as the villains. Their quirks didn't mean they were powerful, but their potential made them powerful. Hisashi scowled, seeing the old Japanese villa emerge from the treetops, his childhood home, and his hell. Izuku now. Izuku swallowed, the lump in his throat feeling horribly big. His grandfather's bony features, his hollow eyes and gray thin hair made him look ill. Yet, despite his old fragile look, Izuku's body screamed danger whenever he faced the old man. Izuku, my dear grandson, my Theseus. Izuku simply nodded, keeping his composure, his 12-year-old body barely able to withstand the immense pressure the blood-red eyes held. The room felt cramped despite the roomly decor, air too dense to breath. It's soon time for you to leave, to embark on your mission, his eyes barely visible behind his wide bony smile. His teeth showed glints of gold and silver. Once again Izuku nodded. You will leave in 7 days at 1,200 hours. We will drop you in Hakame City. You aren't allowed to contact us for at least 2 years. You aren't allowed to use or even reference the Midoriya name. Everything is to be made in your own name and credit. You need to accomplish something that will make the whole world turn their faces. Something that will scream the Midoriya family is still here. Is that understood? The man waved his hands around in big motions, as if he was trying to suggest exactly how big an impact he would have to make to be considered finished. Izuku nodded. The smile widened further on the old man, and Izuku thought for a moment that the man's chins would burst or crack at any second. Have you decided what name you will present yourself under? Izuku took a deep breath. He could feel his heart slightly pump harder beneath his ribs and skin while a feeling of alarm echoed in his mind. One final question, and one that Izuku had to answer himself. It was usually the mother's role to give the child their new name, new identity. But Izuku's mother wasn't there. She wasn't even aware he was still alive. So he had to choose one himself. When he looked in history books, the mothers had given their children various names. Some screamed for attention and portrayed power and authority. Others decided to be more discreet and used their children to rule from the shadows. Some had ridiculous names while others were cool. Some just chose a random name with no real ties to what the child came to achieve. He hadn't actually gotten any helpful tips while he skimmed through the long lines of names other than the name could be practically anything. So he thought about it, what he wanted to be called, what he wanted people to think about when that name was uttered. For ages he wanted to be someone like All Might, someone who saved people with a smile and always stood by the people who were weaker than themselves. Someone who could protect and save. But Izuku knew he could never be that. He had done so much wrong after his father took him here. He had done things that would make people despise him if they only heard his name. The heroes would never accept him. They would never say he was one of them. All Might would never. Deku. His grandfather frowned at the name, showing his clear dislike of the name. Deku as in useless? Izuku could practically see the veins appear on his grandfather's head, getting a mad and almost insane look to what had once been a fragile old man. His grandfather had obviously taken the name as an insult towards the family. His big pride and endless wish for the Midoriya family to rise towards its peak once more never leaving his mind. But Izuku already prepared an answer, had ransacked his brain for multiple sleepless nights trying to come up with a valid excuse to use the name. Grandfather, let me explain and you'll find the name quite intriguing. Yes, Deku as in useless, but that is simply for the rest of the thugs to think. My standing will remain anonymous, my true potential hidden behind a simple mask, a mask where I am simply useless or a puppet. Noon will believe that a mere child would be able to create such elaborate tactics and plans as you have taught me, grandfather. They will believe I am a useless pawn, while they did not realize I am the master of the game. The name can also be understood as able to achieve something, which I have you to thank for that, grandfather. The words felt bitter and insincere on his tongue, voice slightly unused to speaking to many words after one another after being used to give on-word responses or a short consistent meaning. He tried adding a compliment in his words, partly giving his grandfather the credit for his actions while only giving himself the consequences. He learned that tactic long ago, realizing his grandfather loved flattery a bit too much and often pointed out the fact that the bloodline still runs strong in his veins thanks to him. His grandfather was also very similar to his own father in that way, loving compliments but refusing to take the consequences of their actions. For a while his grandfather just looked puzzled, seemingly thinking of the excuse for a long while. His frown slowly turned into something else, something ominous, but happy. Oh, I know that shine didn't betray his chuckling, making shivers run down Izuku's spine. Izuku then. The landscape disappeared behind him, trees, animals, bushes all only staying in view for a split second before they once again were gone. Izuku clenched his All Might stuffy, the feeling of something wrong carving into his guts. His father wasn't who he used to anymore. He wasn't who he wanted him to be. Just 2 days ago his father had been playing hero with him in the living room, holding him in his arms and laughing with his mother. Now just the mere touch they made the man seem to retreat in disgust. His eyes filled with hate. And Izuku couldn't help but question, is it because of me? Izuku shook his head. He knew the answer, but wasn't ready to accept it. Not yet, at least. Maybe Dad would soon go back into his normal self? His kind and loving self? Maybe all of this was just a silly little joke and soon Mom will jump out and give him a bear hug, telling him how much she missed her little hero. Izuku hoped. He hoped all of this was just a really bad dream, that his mother would come and chase away all the bad dreams like she always had done. But he already knew the answer to that too. Soon the car stopped before a huge majestic villa. Despite its simplistic characteristics, it basically screamed luxury. The planks were made in highest quality oak. The bamboo clearly well kept together with decorations of highest quality scattered over the house and garden. The roof was spotless and shined in the early morning sun together with the decorations scattered in a mindful way around the building. Izuku admired and couldn't help but start mumbling how amazing it looked, wondering how much everything cost. how it was kept so clean and how to best keep the quality of the things. It was first when his father basically yanked him out of the car and started walking up the stairs that he stopped. Fear started to tickle in Izuku's small mind. Each step up towards the villa felt more and more ominous, each and every step heavier than the last one. By the time they reached the highest step, Izuku was shaking violently, mumbling and imagining all the horrible situations that could come to the mind of a 4-year-old kid. His father simply glared at him and continued forward, letting the young child follow him on his own accord as they reached the top of the stairs. Izuku hurried after, his small legs barely able to keep up while holding his All Might Stuffy in his arms. The villa was huge in Izuku's emerald eyes. The tapestry portrayed stunning artwork, from calm and serene landscapes to brutal fight scenes. The floorboard creaked lightly under him, his father's steps sending waves of sound from each plank he stepped on. The older green-haired man paid no attention to the younger one behind him, as if he didn't exist. By every step the young boy took, the more fearful he became. The stuffed doll he had in his arms gave a little comfort. He tried to reach for his absent father, hoping he would offer support or comfort. Yet the only thing the young child was met with was a glare of disgust and a forceful slap against his hand. A warning not to try it again. Izuku retracted, feeling an uncomfortable feeling in his chest. It hurts. He didn't like this feeling. Every time he looked at his father, part of him wanted to reach out, ask him to hold him and tell him everything would be okay. But the other part wanted to run away, leave his stupid dad alone and run away, back to mom and tell her he hated dad. Tell her he didn't like him at all and he was a stupid dad. And Izuku didn't like that feeling. He didn't like the divide he felt in his chest. It felt like something was trying to split him apart, and the Izuku didn't like that at all. Izuku didn't notice his father had stopped till he almost bumped into him, just barely avoiding it, staring up at his father with his forest green eyes. His unkempt hair kept getting in the way since he hadn't brushed it before they left. Locks laid in a mess around his head, some sticking up in unnatural ways and others laid flat against his scalp. Izuku wasn't aware how to tame his unruly hair. Mom always did that for him. The boy shook away the thought before it would get the chance to consume him and looked at his father. His father didn't look back, but at the wooden door, his hand resting on the handle. They just stood there for a while, no one making a move or sound. His father simply stood there, contemplating. He looked divided, like he couldn't decide the next course of action and it was weighing him. Izuku bit his lip, contemplating too. Maybe his dad was the one who needed a hug? Izuku still had a bad feeling in his stomach, but pushed it down and slowly reached out his small hand touching the bigger one. All Might was always kind and helped people, and Izuku wanted to be like All Might. But his father flinched and instinctively slapped away the boy's hand, glaring at him before opening the door in front of them. A part of Izuku's heart broke at that moment, a part that could never really be repaired. The room before them was dimly lit, the silhouette of a man on the other side of the room. He was sitting on the floor with crossed legs, a teacup in hand that filled the air with a fragrance of dried leaves. Izuku could hear how his father's breath hitched, his motion slightly cower, and it was like the man in front of him shrunk. Father, a single word yet holding so many emotions. Longing, sadness, anger, disappointment, all of it flowing out in a single word. Son. Emotionless. Izuku peeked out behind his own father, the man in front revealing more details. He had thin gray hair, his structure slim yet muscular. He had slight dark bags under his blood-red eyes, and his hands that were grasping the teacup looked bony and fragile. He wore a simple robe, in a plain red color with a slight golden thread tracing his arms and collar. Izuku met the man's eyes, ruby eyes locking with emerald ones, and the old man smiled. Izuku felt the shivers run down his spine, the needle-like feeling leaving him defenseless against the older man. Hisashi. Yes, father. Leave. I want to have some quality time with my sweet grandbaby. The green-eye boy felt his blood run cold, the feeling of danger drowning his senses. He looked up at his father in a pleading, begging manner, desperately asking his father not to leave, not to go, not to leave him alone with this man. Hisashi didn't even glance at the boy. He simply gave a slight bow, before pushing past the young child and closing the door behind him. The boy stood in the middle of the room, gripping his All Might plush in a death grip. His ill-matched clothes and unkempt hair that kept falling in his eyes didn't make the judgmental look that the older man gave him any better. So Izuku stood there, with his heart in his throat, unconsciously starting to mumble how he wanted to go home, how he missed his mom and a load of other things. Child. Izuku snapped out of his mumbling, staring at the man between his green locks. Come. An order. Izuku felt his legs move on his own, the fear making him abide. The floor creaked slightly under his weight, and the closer he got to the elder, the more details he saw. The dim light in the room now felt as clear as daylight. The shallow veins running across his features, his dry lips and scarred skin leaving questions with no answers. Izuku stood almost right in front of the man when the man threw his hand out, grabbing Izuku's face roughly and yanking him towards him. Panic. Izuku felt panic and fear. The overwhelming panic that drowned him and the fear he felt for the older man. So Izuku bit. The feeling of flesh against his teeth, the fresh iron taste of blood, and the slight flinch the older man gave when he let go, groaning at the wound. Izuku pushed himself away, ready to run away, the iron taste still tasting fresh in his mouth. Instead, a bellowing laugh echoed in the room, and Izuku felt confused. He looked at the older man, his body ready, waiting for the older man's next course of action. His All Might plush laying disregarded between the two. Oh, I like this one. No one ever dared to choose fight against me before. His chuckling leaves a raspy aftertone. Red eyes gleaming in amusement. Show me your eyes, kid. Izuku hesitated, but decided to oblige. He removed the green strands from his vision, and the older man broke out in an uncomfortably big smile. The gray-haired man raised his finger and Izuku could feel himself tense, and the man snapped with his fingers. Darkness. All light in the room disappearing in a mere millisecond. Izuku felt startled, looking around trying to distinguish anything in the now pitch-black room. Before he felt it, the overpowering force pushing him down on the floor, the harsh wooden floor hitting him hard against his back. The heavy feeling on top of him made Izuku claw against whatever was pushing him down, panic bubbling up worse than before. He felt the touch against his forehead, removing his green locks, and Izuku starred. He stared at what was on top of him, and what was staring back. Red gleaming eyes, filled with insanity and joy. Izuku left the dining room, hurrying towards his chambers. The usual bitter aftertaste dominated his senses. Part of him wondered if it was poison, but quickly disregarded the thought. He had been taught to be immune against almost all poisons, so the boy was all too familiar with the taste it would produce. The young boy continues through the labyrinth known as his home. The excuse he had given his grandfather had been valid, but it had also been just that, an excuse. The name was far more thought through and tactically picked than just a silly little name meaning useless. His real reason for choosing Deku had been different. It was a call for help, a desperate scream for someone to save him, and if anyone would recognize that name, it would be Kaken, his best friend from his childhood. The boy with too much pride, but still his friend, the only friend he ever had. Izuku slipped into a corner on his right, continuing his usual path. He partly hoped his old friend would remember him, and once he announced his name, he would know Izuku wasn't dead. He could tell his mother he was still alive. Maybe not well, but alive, and that's all Izuku actually needed. He sighed as he pushed the door to his room open, the simple decor and with almost no personal touch meeting him. When he was younger, he wanted to put All Might posters all over his walls again, to start getting more figurines and toys to keep him company in the new environment. He had gotten none. He wasn't even allowed to draw All Might posters as his father burned all of his attempts. He had soon given up, leaving the room as it was. Hollow, deserted. The thing Izuku wanted the most, though, was images or pictures from before all of this. Pictures, drawings, photos, anything that reminded him of what life had been before all of this. He wanted a picture of his mother, something to remind him that all of this hadn't always been his life. Images flashed his mind, but all were blurry. He remembered slight things about her still, but they often only felt like a lucid dream rather than a memory. Sometimes he questioned if she even existed or if the kind woman was only a fragment of his fantasy. When he was younger, he had tried to draw her, Over and over again he had tried to hide the art his small hands had created in various places only to be discovered by either his own father or the maids. When his father had found them he had made a point by burning them in front of his eyes, shouting and screaming about how dare he try and make him feel bad. How dare he make such hideous art of his wife and a bunch of other things Izuku didn't want to remember. When the maids had found them they had simply thrown them away, rarely in a way that made it possible for him to retrieve them. The only thing he had left was the dirty and worn All Might plush, barely recognizable from its former glory. And one more thing. The clothes he had worn when he was brought here. The ill-matched socks, the All Might shirt and trousers. But they were no longer in the shape of small children's clothes, but rather in the shape of a teddy bear sitting by the far edge of his bed. Izuku couldn't help but glance at the skillfully tailored stuffed animal. He reminisced of the time he was still able to wear the old worn clothes himself. It had taken him a long time to stop wearing the clothes, even when they were sitting painfully tight over his growing body, even when they had prevented his movements in uncomfortable ways and had both his grandfather and father chew him out for his childish behavior. He had kept them on, he had kept wearing them. It was only when he accidentally had ripped the shirt reality hit and he could no longer wear the old clothes. He had cried for hours, holding the worn and unkempt clothes close to his heart as if that would make them magically fit again. A maid he had known as Hana Misura had heard him, and in a desperate call for help he had given her his clothes, begging her to fix them. She had given him a warm smile, a smile Izuku still held dear in his heart, and disappeared with them. Izuku had waited anxiously for hours, too worried to concentrate on his lessons and too distracted to win any of his sparring. But once he returned to his room that night, the bear had been sitting neatly on his desk with a little note. It might not be what the young master meant, but I hope it will ease your heart's clench. / Hana. And Izuku had slept with that bear, holding it tight in his arms as the beautiful work got wet from his tears. He had wanted to thank the maid, to tell her how grateful he was for her workmanship and express the endless amount of gratitude. But he had never had the chance. The boy never saw the maid after that. He asked around, but none of the servants seemed to acknowledge her existence. It wasn't until years later, when he had sneaked through the big house, looking for some midnight snack, that the last puzzle piece finally landed on the complicated structure. He had seen one of the maids go around wearing the woman's bracelet, claiming she found it in the woods beside some spider lilies. Izuku still remembers the feeling of his heart stopping, yet rush of blood drowning any further of the maid's discussions. The guilt and grief washed over him like a tsunami, drowning him. The one person who had shown him kindness, the one person who had shown him a warm and sincere smile, was gone. Because of him, he still felt that nerve-killing numbness whenever the thought crossed his mind, whenever the kind smile she had worn flashed through his eyes. He didn't have the ability to process those emotions, and didn't dare to open that door in fear of what might hide behind it. The boy sighed again, sitting on the plain bed and letting himself fall back on the soft mattress, the bear slightly moving together with the rest of the bed. The ceiling stared at him with its chronically clean white color, the flimmering from the lamp barely visible to the human eye. A simple desk and chair stood waiting for him, dozens of scientific books and research papers piled up in high towers and even more cramming his bookshelves. Green eyes hid from the world behind a silk of pitch black. Izuku closed his eyes and let the exhaustion run through his bones. He had things to do, things to prepare and get ready for his departure, but he just didn't have the energy. Every day was filled to the brink with lessons, fighting and sparring. He rarely got the time to rest his sore muscles, to fall into a deep slumber and just recover. Let his muscles and mind truly relax, because he always had to be on guard. The bloodlust he could now feel from a mile away, the frequent questioning who to trust and how much he should trust them, the common feeling of being watched or observed tingling his bones in a warning. Assassins were a frequent visitor for the boy who hadn't even become a teenager yet. They came from all over, different families and groups, all with the same goal in mind: to end him. Even his own father and grandfather had periodically sent assassins under the guise for him to learn. He believed his grandfather, but knew better than to think anything different about his father. His father's disgust and loathing of him had only grown with the years, now to the point Izuku didn't even think he saw him as a human being, but rather some annoying bug he couldn't seem to squash. His abuse only grew worse with the years under the simple excuse of learning. In a way, Izuku was lucky for the world-class healers stationed on the villa. In other ways, death was more of a mercy than whatever this place offered. He lost count on the amount of times he had been on the brink of death, gone into shock, lost limbs only for them to be sewed back again. He had almost succumbed to blood loss, poison, broken bones, and so much more. And every time the healers and doctors had done their best to bring him back, with no scars or visible trace of what he had to endure, other than those left in his mind. Izuku couldn't breathe. The weight had left him and the light had turned back on. His grandfather was sitting in the same place as before, but he still couldn't breathe. The child tried to breathe in again and again and again and again, but it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Why couldn't he breathe? Tears trickled down his cheeks, green eyes watering with panic and fear. It felt like he was trying to breathe through a straw, a slim, clogged-up straw that just barely let any air through. The child started to hyperventilate, trying to get any air through to his small lungs. Beside him, at the same spot he had been sitting when Izuku entered the room, was the older man. He was sitting there quietly, judgmental eyes observing Izuku. His breath was barely audible to the human ears, but the child picked up the small sound and tried to mimic it. His heart was beating roughly in his chest, but with no air to pump to his limbs. Things around him started to turn blurry. Things started to merge and spin into a horrible mess. The young boy couldn't tell if it was the tears or something else. The floor seemed to be moving and shifting underneath him. His balance was feeling more and more disorientated. The older man's breath still ringing in his ears. He kept trying to snap it up, kept trying to match the rhythm. Breath in, breath in. He continued trying to match the gray-haired man's rhythm, slowly feeling the surge of oxygen in his lungs. As Izuku finally looked up, the man seemed almost amused. In that moment, Izuku wished he could have been as brave as Kaken and ask what he was laughing at. Sit a simple yet clear order. For a few minutes, the man only stared at the boy, eyes hiding unreadable thoughts. He put down his now cold tea beside him, hands resting on his knees. He sternly glared into the child in front of him with no warmth or kindness. Do you know what the Midoriya family is, child? Izuku shook his head, having a feeling that whatever answer he knew would be incorrect in the senior's ears. The Midoriya family is an ancient power core. The values and beliefs of each generation create rippling effects on the world. We existed long before quirks and have ruled in the shadows. Blood-red eyes pierced into glowing forest green ones. Each being is born with something known as potential, their ability to achieve things, to grow and evolve. A human's potential exceeds any other animal, any other being on this earth. That is why humans dominate the food chain. We took our weaknesses and made counters to them. We made them our strengths. Every being is also born with a certain amount of potential. Some have more, while others have well less. And this is where the Midoriya family is different from the rest. The Midoriya family is the definition of potential. We are born with more potential than any other beings, and we evolve faster, grow and learn faster than any other being out there. He stopped and stared into the boy's sparkling eyes. The silence dragged on, uncomfortable and thick. Izuku shifted in his seat, trying to avoid his grandfather's gaze. The man before him opened his mouth, once again letting his words rip the air. And that potential is seen in our eyes. The child blinked at the comment, slightly confused at the statement. Their eyes? What was so special about their eyes? Before he could ask, his grandfather had already continued. Have you ever noticed how every child around you seems? He rolled his hand, trying to find the right word. Short-sighted or ludicrous, he settled with. Izuku opened his mouth, about to protest but quickly shut it. The boy couldn't argue with it, though. The other kids always seemed to fight over such silly reasons. They only wanted their own way and couldn't listen to anyone else. It didn't seem like they understood anything, and often they got mad over nothing. They said really rude things without batting an eye and judged people ruthlessly. But weren't most other people the same too? A lot of adults seem to be like that too, right? He saw and heard so many adults talk in ways that put his kindergarten mates to shame, in ways that made Izuku's skin crawl and ways that had made him freeze. So Izuku stayed quiet, not mentioning his thoughts and holding in his head so as not to mumble. Humans are a foolish species. Most have a lot of potential, but so many people never bother to unlock it. The Midoriya family is different from them. We can unlock our full potential in superior ways, but also use that potential in ways other people could not. You might have heard stories of people with extreme feats, people who managed to change thousands of people's opinion with a single speech, managed to solve unsolved cases decades old with but a fraction of information as the rest, shoot targets miles away, or even save hundreds with but a simple tool or way. But you also heard of the people who killed millions with no regards, founded ways of torture and misery for the pleasure of themselves, and then created weapons that could destroy entire continents. The gray-haired man locked eyes with the green-eyed boy. Slim fingers circled the teacup he had disregarded beside him, acting as if it all or a sudden had become the most interesting object in the room. He picked it up and let his critical eyes wander over the craftsmanship. And the Midoriya family have traces and footprints in all of those cases. Izuku's eyes widened, gripping his trousers hard as his small head processed the information he had gotten. He could vaguely hear how his grandfather placed the cup back down on the wooden floor, but his mind was racing too fast for him to truly register it. The Midoriya family was dangerous. His instincts told him that far. If what his grandfather told him was true, a single person's beliefs and upbringing could lead the whole world to war or create peace within it. They could change and decide who lived and died, or wrap them up till they made their choice. Like a spider playing with the prey in their web. Do you know his grandfather started slowly? His voice slowly getting more and more hoarse from all the talking. What all of these people had in common except the Midoriya name. Izuku shook his head again, feeling a sort of dread build up in his stomach. They all had glowing eyes. The young child felt a mixture of excitement and dread fill his inner core, mixing into some unpleasant feeling where he didn't know what to feel. On one end, he could save people like All Might. On another end, he could be the one to end them. Grandfather/Jinjiro Midoriya then. The older man simply looked at the younger generation before him. The green-haired boys mumbling incoherent and randomly pieced together words to whatever had popped up in his mind right then. But what he couldn't take his eyes off was the eyes. The forest green eyes that looked like lanterns behind his unruly hair. Even when Jinjiro had been younger and the Midoriya family still stood tall, none of his elders had had such eyes. Sure, they had been gleaming, but only slightly. This boy's eyes were glowing. They were radiating green light that almost made Jinjiro shudder. His own great-grandfather had been regarded and praised for his outstanding potential and the glow in his eyes. But compared to the boy in front of him that was mumbling so fast words didn't even have the time to leave his lips before the next one started. It was like comparing a singular star to a full supermoon. It was a clear saying in the family, a law in a way. The more your eyes glow, the more potential you possess. Some people didn't even receive their glow until early adulthood. Even more didn't receive it at all. This amount of glow, this amount of potential, was thrilling to the old man. It was like he had the possibility to mold the world anew, going against any natural law that had been put to bind him. And the older man couldn't help but feel that he could finally restore the weakening light of the Midoriya family. Something he longed for the longest of time. His own useless son being nothing compared to the gold. No diamond mine in front of him. Izuku now. Thumb, pang, thumb. The repeating pattern of hits and kicks echoed through the big training hall. A young boy moving so fast his movements would become a blur in the eyes of spectators. His hands landed on the boxing pillow again and again, the heavy object swaying at the impact. Training, sparring, and lessons. Constantly on guard against anything that could pose a threat. The week went by without anything too unusual. His lessons went on with new subjects almost every day, sometimes deep digging into whatever he had learned previously. His grandfather seemed to get more and more excited every day, going as far as preaching to anyone willing, or sometimes less willing, to hear him as he talked about the feat his grandson might be able to achieve. His father had avoided him like the plague, something he far more preferred than being forced to have sparring matches to the point he couldn't stand. In a way, it felt like a huge relief to leave the household, to finally be able to leave this place he considered to be worse than hell. But there was also an uncertainty within him, asking if he would survive the upcoming 2.5 years and achieving his grandfather's wishes. He knew the Midoriya family had grown weaker during the last decades, mostly due to his own grandfather and father's incompetence. His father had simply run away from home, leaving everything behind him and rushing to find his own way in the world. He had no competence and blamed all his failures on everyone else. He believed he was superior and should be treated as such. Yet he couldn't even do basic tasks that would demand you had a brain. He would flaunt money as a way to solve his problems, never considering other aspects than whichever one suited his taste more. He was more of a child than Izuku ever had been. And his grandfather was no better. He had too much pride to accept when he was wrong, and his obsession with once again making the Midoriya family rise had instead plunged it to its fall. He made bad deals and rarely saw all the factors. He trusted his vessels too much to the point they would steal or whisper about him behind his back. And his mind was no longer in its prime. He had started to forget things, his emotions being worn on his sleeves and often explosive. It got far worse with just the last 2 years, as when Izuku and his father first arrived at the site he had still been fairly clear in his head, made rational decisions and held a high dignity in his way. But his pride had always been his biggest weakness. Pang! Izuku looked down at his bruised hands, skin broken and blood leaking through. The clear red stains on the boxing pillow looked aggressive against the light fabric. His mind had wandered again, but he was content that he had kept his habit of mumbling underway. Despite all the attempts they made to remove his incoherent speech, it still remained a part of him. It was rare now, but it would slip out now and then if his mind was too occupied and it needed something to express or vent all the things in his mind. He had stayed in the gym a bit longer today, using it as an excuse to miss dinner with his grandfather. It had been one of those rare days his grandfather had been in a happy mood, so Izuku had taken the opportunity and claimed he wanted to train more to make the older man proud. The gray-haired man had easily agreed with a wide crazed smile grazing his lips. So Izuku stood alone in the big hall, all sorts of training equipment standing around him. He sent away all the instructors and maids, saying he wished to train alone. The eerie quiet left his mind to wander. During these last 8 years, Izuku had gone through so many things. Every day had been packed with activities, lessons, fighting, and theories. He knew so much, more than most people would know during their entire lifetime. From smithing the finest sword to arranging the most beautiful flowers. From dressing lethal wounds to being the one to inflict them. He could disguise himself perfectly, or blend himself into anything. His potential had far exceeded his grandfather's expectations and his talents in each area giving the man a childish amount of joy. Meanwhile, Izuku only felt like a tool, a doll sitting on the strings waiting for his next movement that wasn't even his own. He always had to be mindful of his words and actions, read the room and analyze his opponent. He felt trapped. With a single swing, Izuku's hand smashed against the boxing pillow with enough force that it ripped in the fabric on the other side. Small sandcorns started to dress the floor, soon more and more ripping up the tier, and the sound of sand hitting the floor filled the silent place. His hand was dripping with a crimson fluid, but the young boy didn't even bat an eye. It would heal soon enough. It always did. I wonder how life would be if I had never been brought here. A simple thought, one that grazed the boy's mind many times. What if it was only his father that would have left, leaving him and his kind mother behind? What if he never had the potential? What if he just had simply been quirkless? Would his life have looked better then? Izuku shook his head, knowing the what if would never quell his misery. He let himself sit down on the floor, slowly falling back and resting against its gummy-like texture. The cool surface felt refreshing against his skin, his hair looking like a mane of green curls. "I'm tired," he said to no one in particular. "I wonder how it will be in Hackame. I heard so many stories of the place, the absolute nightmare it seems to be. Though it can't be much worse than this place," he scoffed, the only one hearing his monologue being himself. "I wonder how it will feel there, how different it will be. I wonder how I will manage to survive. Here, at least here, Izuku always had the doctors and healers to patch him up. His body already did a wonderful job at that by itself, the potential he possessed giving him a far more enduring body and a superior healing speed. It was to the point he could sometimes even see his own body heal, patching the bruises and wounds he had gotten previously. He reached out his hands towards the ceiling, inspecting where the bleeding wounds had just a few minutes ago bruised his skin. and how it now looked like it almost was days ago he did it. Izuku knew better than to overvalue his ability, knowing full well it would come and bite him in the arse if he did. But he also knows he should be thankful for said ability, because without it he would have perished long ago. For a long while the young boy simply laid there, the urge to move non-existent. Tomorrow he will leave. Tomorrow was the final day of this hellhole and he could finally leave. But he couldn't go home. Even if he was certain he could escape and leave this place, even if he would disappear from the world map and leaving no one to find him, his grandfather would do anything in his power to return him. And that included hurting those he once knew. Mom. Izuku didn't stop the tears as they rolled down his freckled cheeks. He made a promise to himself long ago that whatever it took, he would see her again. And if that meant turning the entire world upside down, he would. Izuku pushed himself off the floor, not bothering wiping his tears, and instead heading back to the main house. He needed to rest. God knows he wouldn't get it for a while after this. Hisashi paced back and forth, his mind wandering longer than his legs did. He brought Izuku here as his father instructed, and he now left the kid with said father. And he was worried. What was his father gonna say? Will he be disappointed? Or will he be satisfied, considering that damn child isn't just forsaken by God, but also he is forsaken of a quirk? Hisashi let out a loud tisk, ignoring the hurrying servants that were quick to avoid him. He slumped down against a wall, waiting for the door to open and his father would give him his judgment. Maybe finally his father would realize that he was the best shot for the family and stop obsessing so much over some glowing eyes. After all, it was almost ridiculous how much his father obsessed over those stupid eyes. Like quirks were so much more impressive than some silly glow. His thoughts got interrupted by the sound of doors opening. The small green-haired boy followed by an older male stepped out of the room. The elder man waved away the boy with a servant and it looked like he smiled in joy. Hisashi felt a shiver run down his spine at the creepy smile his father wore, quickly shaking it off as he stood up and approached the older male. Finally figured out all of this was a waste of time? He snarled, feeling overconfident. Shut up, you useless waste of space. The voice was cold, unchanging. Hisashi flinched at the words but recovered just as quickly. You can't be serious. Is there something about him? Just because he has some stupid glowing eyes? Hisashi hissed, something he never would have dared in the long past. That child can't be worth shit, not when he didn't even have a quirk. Hisashi was still confident he was better. He just needed his old man to understand that some silly glow from a legend wasn't that impressive anymore. Now it was all about quirks. The senior man's red eyes slowly turned and locked with Hisashi's own blood-red eyes. Hisashi's legs gave in, while building up in his throat and cold sweat breaking out from his skin. His entire body was shaking, every hair on his body standing up as his every shaking breath barely let in any oxygen into his hurting lungs. It was like getting engulfed and slowly suffocating in the air itself. If you weren't my son, I would have ended you right here and now. The sentence drew chills down the man's spine. The threat so true his entire being didn't let him move under the older man's predatory gaze. He has more potential than you could ever dream of, boy. In all your years on this earth, you are but a worthless piece that is only to be disregarded. You claim you are important, think you are worth something and people should praise you. But let me remind you, you are but a worthless, useless being whose only purpose is to be a breeding horse. And to think you almost failed at that too. You are nothing but a stupid failure. Every word was coated with his father's spite and disgust. Every sentence a new promise of demise. Hisashi couldn't breathe. The pressure from the gaze pressing down on his lungs pressed down with such force he wondered if he ever had been able to breathe. It was only his father turned his heels and walked away, muttering something about disappointment while not even glancing back at his biological son, that Hisashi could feel the chilly air slip into his lungs once again. Left behind the senior was a quivering mess sitting on the floor, trying to hold back the bile burning in the back of his throat. Once the silver-haired man finally was out of sight, Hisashi colored the floor with his stomach's content. He threw up till there was nothing left, body shaking like a leaf on an autumn branch. He took a raspy breath, feeling his throat burn. He looked up, feeling his head explode in pain. Everything was spinning, or was he spinning? Was it ever still? Walls leaned in on him, laughing and pointing at him. Faces appeared on the hardwood floor, howling at his failures and pathetic appearance. Even the air seemed to whisper about his failures. The man felt so small, the reminder of his childhood all too close, and Hisashi felt a burning amount of rage with it. A hatred so strong any lingering love he might have held for his own son was burned to crisp with not even a single trace of coal could be found. He was far more impressive than that piece of shit he called son. The boy didn't even have a fucking quirk. He clenched his jaw to the point he could feel the metallic taste seep onto his tongue. A smoking breath escaped his lips, glimpses of ember dying in the air. What was so damn special about some sparkly eyes anyway? People had quirks that could do that. And his quirk was actually good because he had one. The man's anger didn't tire, but rather blossomed every time he thought of it. He was more superior than some 4-year-old with sparkly eyes. He was far more dangerous and could easily get people to yield to him, and he would make his father change his mind, even if he had to step and squash every damn being on this earth to prove it. And he would start with the thing known as his son. Breaking news. We are currently hovering over the criminals' capital, Hakkame City. Just now, the city had been attacked by an unknown force, blowing up big regions of the city, and casualties are still unclear. Another explosion was heard, sending shockwaves through the air, and the helicopter shook against the impact. The reporter cursed under her breath, holding the handle as hard as she could, her hands running white against the death grip. Screams were heard down on the ground. Another sound of panicked citizens trying to find cover before the next unknown bomb would blow. The attack started in the middle of the night at around 2:30 am. The motive is unclear and attackers unknown. No government or police can reach the area due to the protective shield around the city, which means no one can get inside to oversee the casualties, and no one can get out to escape them. The reporter continued in a serious voice. Her voice trembled slightly at the last sentence. Another explosion was heard further away, and they braced themselves against the next wave of shock waves to hit them. Once again, the extensive force hit hard against the helicopter's metal walls. The buzzing sound of the pilot screamed in the reporter's ears, leaving curses to fly from her mouth before she shot a look towards the crumbling city. We will return later to further inform you of the state of the criminals' capital. Heroes all over the world already sent on standby to intersect the moment it seems to become slightly safe. But for now, fate will be their judge. The helicopter swayed from the horrendous city, its state crumbling beyond them. The cameraman zoomed in further on the destructive state the city was in before it disappeared in the horizon, and he shut off the feed. What the fuck is even going on? The reporter breathed, her breath hitching as she coughed the small amount of smoke that had slipped into her lungs. I have no fucking clue. Hakkame City has stood independent for decades, and no alliance or government have even been able to make a dent on the place. The cameraman answered, adjusting the camera as he cleaned the lens. I heard fucking horror story after horror story of that place, each one worse than the previous. His colleague nodded, watching as another bomb went off and a crumbling building crashed towards the ground. She couldn't help but question how they got past all the city's security feeds and organized such a big-scale attack. Hakkame City may be a place for outlaws, but it was more secure than most military bases around the world. It had been a reason why it managed to stand independent against dozens of countries trying to bring it down, hundreds of groups trying to destroy it, and thousands of failed missions to finally break its influence. I'm just wondering what crazy fucker actually managed to pull it if she whispered back, barely audible against the sound of the helicopter. For a moment, the man across from her simply stared, no answer grazing his lips. When he finally opened his mouth, though hesitation and uncertainty clouded his tone. Whoever it is, I'm not sure if I should be relieved or fear for my life, since that person probably will soon walk among us and we will be none the wiser. His eyes locked hers. And what more they can do, considering what they did against the world's most dangerous, vengeful and scheming city without anyone even suspecting the tiniest thing. Both people gulped, looking back at the city that was still on fire, and the sound of another bomb traveled through the air. Eraserhead now. The city stood in shambles, fire and screams intertwining into a deathly melody. People stood slamming their fists against the shield, The shield that was supposed to keep them safe had instead been the one to seal their fate. Heroes and officials were standing outside working tirelessly against the clock to try and dismantle the shield with no luck. The dying screams of people on the other side only further digging into their desperation. Despite the fact that Hakim City was known for its criminals in it, only fools would believe it was solely criminals in the city walls. Children, victims, slaves, and other people that had been forcefully brought into the city or been born there still resided inside. Military power kept pouring in from all over the world together with world-renowned heroes that were on standby in case the shield would finally shatter and break. "This is one of the biggest shitshows I ever witnessed," a blonde hero spoke. His hair standing tall against the shockwaves and his glasses broken in one of their sockets after a particular small stone had hit in from one of the shockwaves. The man next to him simply answered with a huff, barely acknowledging how the usually loud male sounded awfully timid. They both were called there with urgency in the late afternoon, and they had to warp there with one of the government officials' quirk. It had been a sickening feeling, but also a slight feeling of reminiscence. The older male shook his head, burrowing his head in a scarf tucked around his neck. It was indeed a shitshow, as his friend had stated, the splattering blood coloring the ground behind the shield in a scarlet color, the smell of burnt corpses making the bile come up to his throat on waves before he once again swallowed it down. The shitshow had been active for almost 12 hours now, then just arrived 2 or 3 hours ago. People all around them looked anxious and scared. New heroes and military kept pouring in a fighting-ready stance. Those who had been there for a while had removed themselves from the front lines, the destruction and horrors too much to bear even for seasoned veterans. The dark-haired man dwelled to have to go inspect the area and try to save the survivors when the shield fell, not because he thought it would be any. Beside him did his acquaintance state a few words now and then, simply voicing his observation or his thoughts out loud in hope someone would answer back and indulge them in an endless conversation. The long hours passed, each minute feeling like an eternity compared to the previous one. His friend moved to chat with some other heroes from other regions or countries, all discussing the event and what had happened. But the question grazing everyone's mind was the same. Who was behind all of this? No country or officials took the blame or praise. No one actually dared to take it either, knowing full well how vengeful the citizens and villains around the world were. All groups and governments seemed to be in the dark about it, and no one truly understood who had organized this attack. The dark-haired man shook his head, once again focusing his attention towards the ruins of the city before him. The screams had since long died down. No building stood talking more than 5 meters, and no wall seemed to be truly intact. Burned corpses and the smoky smell of fire blew with the wind. The male hadn't seen a single movement from the city in well over an hour. People had started to lose focus, instead talking quietly among themselves or just throwing a quick glance towards the ruins of the city. The bombs had quieted down the silence from the area more frightening than anything he ever experienced. But no one noticed the slight movement. Deep in the city was a slight movement moving from the rubble. No one except for one. The black-haired hero flinched at the moment in the far distance. Uncertain if his eyes fooled him or now, he grabbed his binoculars, placing them against his red eyes. He was peering through the small openings. A young boy emerged from the rubble, his ruffled hair filled with dust and dirty black clothes clinging to his frame. The older male couldn't make out how old the boy was, but he was quite muscular and tall. His hair was tied up in a messy ponytail, only his back facing against the pro-hero. His black hair swayed in the wind, and the sight left the man speechless. The scene of a young adult, a teen at most, standing alone in a pool of blood and intestines and gore. His eyes turned away from him as they scanned the area. Till they didn't. Green glowing eyes stared right into the pro-hero. His eyes staring straight into the soul of the man as the pro-hero dropped the binoculars, catching the attention of his friend. "Aizawa? You good man?" A worried voice echoed, the male simply ignoring him as he fumbled with the binoculars and once again looked in the direction of the boy, only to discover there was nothing there. "Wha?" Aizawa looked confused, his eyes wide and his voice breaking. His blonde friend gave him a worried look. Not being able to ever recall his friend is such a trance. "Aizawa? Are you all right, mate?" He reached out, but before he made contact with the man in front of him, a small drop of water landed on his hand. And soon, the entire desert-like plain was covered in drops of rain as it just got heavier and heavier. And right before their eyes, the shield flimmered and disappeared into nothing. Izuku then, arriving at Hakame City. The helicopter hovered over the desert-like city, the sand stretching far over the stone-like city. There were crumbling buildings everywhere. Broken glass and the brutalism architecture left a hollow aftertaste. Further away you could slightly see another set of architectural choices had been made, other buildings standing tall and seemingly newly constructed. Izuku's semi-short hair waved in the wind as the pilot instructed him how far he was going to go, handing him the parachute and once again explaining the mission's goal and rules, as if Izuku hadn't heard them a million times already. The young boy clenched the parachute, trying to fill the hollow hole in his chest with determination. He stared down at the buildings beneath him, the area broken and bruised in unknown power struggles. Buildings that looked like they would collapse at any given moment tried to stretch for the sky, roofs with big holes gaping up at the white orb and marks of big fights cluttering every structure. The criminals' capital, Hakame, where millions of organizations had originated from, where the most wanted criminals resided and lived. A place with no law and order to keep its residents safe or alive. It was the principle of survival of the fittest. The weak were preyed upon, and if you didn't show your worth, you'll be consumed immediately by the horrors impeded in the city. A consequence to the upcoming of quirks, and what happened when the worst side of society got too much of a foothold. Izuku took a deep breath and threw himself out of the helicopter. The whipping wind was trying to tear him apart, the feeling of air trying to hold him up and the gravity that was brutally dragging him down made it hard to breathe. But the young boy didn't focus on that. Instead he counted, making sure each second of his fall mattered. He needed to release the parachute at the right moment, and pray that it didn't tangle as it would result in his immediate death. He checked the altitude displayed on his wrist, seeing the numbers fall in a scary fast motion.
5031 forint, 4682 forint, 3949 forint.
Izuku pulled the string, the sound of the parachute unfolding behind him. He clenched his entire body, waiting for the jerk that would mean the parachute successfully unfolded. And the jerk came, the harsh snap sound of the parachute unfolding, the rope stretching and the gravity abruptly ceasing to exist for a split second, before once again taking a hold of him. The large green parachute unfolded in a majestic grace, wind playing with the loose strands of rope, and Izuku was flying. His green eyes were sparkling in excitement, the rush of adrenaline pumping through his veins, and the rumbling laughter that had escaped his lips. Izuku felt free. Cold wind whipped and teared at his face, birds flying by, some so close their soft feathers brushed his pale skin. The world beyond him felt so distant, buildings coming closer, details becoming more and more refined. Small dots of people moved around like ants, walking through the labyrinth of roads. For the first time in as long as the boy could remember, he was free. The shackles that had been holding him had been removed, nothing forcing him down to the ground and suffocating him. Well, except one single chain that remained to keep him from being truly free, the most suffocating one of them all. But compared to before, the green-haired male took it as a win. The closer he got to the city, the more details he could distinguish. His plan was to get a quick overview of the place, try and memorize the layout as much as he could and the situation before landing in the outskirts. The area around him was a mess. No matter where his emerald eyes turned, there was some sort of obvious criminal act being bargained or acted upon. The stores were barricaded in most places, offensive and inappropriate graffiti sprayed at every wall he could see. It was partly overgrown in places where vines and a spark of color in the form of flowers blossomed. But the further he looked, the difference between different areas were as clear as night and day. Turfs. His lips stretched into a thin line, hands becoming white as he gripped the rope leading to his parachute. He probably chose the right place to descend, or at least he hoped. The people beneath him were all too busy to cause or avoid trouble to look up. And even if they did, most didn't bother to question it. They were probably used to seeing unusual things or simply didn't care, or knew whatever was coming from the sky would be dead before it hit the ground. A few stationary shops were open, most just temporary and put up at the sides of the roads. All sorts of merchandise was being sold, from things you find in an everyday food market to lethal poison and guns. Izuku had read some reports about the place. often about multiple countries trying to overtake the capital with force, trade, or whatever they could to lessen the influence it held. None had worked. They even tried to bomb it once, but that also failed as the place had some protective artifacts stationed at hidden places in the city, making any attempt to damage the city from the air completely useless. The place was like a spider web. Anyone stepping foot in it would be stuck, unable to get out, waiting for the hunter to come and pick them off one after one. And Izuku had all the intention of being the most dangerous spider of them all, with a venom so deadly even the biggest spiders would fall by his hands. The hollow hole in his chest didn't budge, despite the resolve he felt. Izuku simply ignored the feeling like he has done so many times before. Instead, he let his eyes wander over the turf he had found, uncertain information flooding his mind. He heard it before he saw it, his body reacting before he himself recognized what was happening. A bullet flew past him where his leg had been just a moment ago. He twisted the parachute to change its direction, each bullet grazing past him. The young boy let out a flurry of curses, trying to move in the limited space he had. Another bullet flew past him, hitting nothing other than the wind at his side. The shooter seemed inexperienced with their inaccuracy and were mostly just shooting at Izuku instead of considering the thing that was holding him up. The parachute complained at his jiggling. The ropes tensed under his rough movements. A bad shooter, in other words, that or they just wanted to have some fun and immobilize him before his landing. The green-eyed boy was still far up, too far up to be able to land without any severe damage. His eyes kept moving, searching for options while the bullets kept coming, only taking brief pauses in between to reload the small gun. The boy kept count, making sure to avoid each and every bullet or dodge it before it made contact with his flesh. He could see the glimmering of a gun in one of the broken windows, eyes milky white piercing into his soul with a shit-eating grin dressing the offender's face. Heart pumping so loud in his ears, Izuku felt his blood run warm in his veins. The pit in his stomach and throat laughing at his fragile attempt to find something, anything to be honest. And then he saw his escape, a half-broken roof with a fabric hanging to provide some shelter from the blazing sun. It didn't seem secure, not at all, but it was also the best option he got. Izuku filled his lungs with oxygen, trying to forget the adrenaline pumping through his mind and probably also clouding his judgment. He only had one chance. The young boy started to unbuckle himself from all of the parachute safety precautions, swift and precise moments working up all the various mechanics that would keep him from falling. The bullets had slowed down, probably meaning the opponent started to lose their ammunition, or that they actually started to aim. The sound of his own heartbeat screamed in his ears, his fingers working as fast as they could. Izuku cursed when a bullet grazed his arm, tearing through the fabric of his jacket and leaving a trickling trail of blood to leak through his arm. The desperation started to set in as Izuku guided the parachute the last way while still figuring out how to land in a somewhat safe way. The sound of another bullet rang in his ear, and before he fully realized what he did, he had let go. The bullet flew right where his head had been, the feeling of falling not letting him think what would have happened if he let go a millisecond later. The boy stretched out, trying to let the air resistance lessen the fall before gracefully curling into a ball to protect his organs and important body parts. He crashed into the fabric, feeling it lessen the fall before collapsing under the stress and embracing him in its folds. The adrenaline felt overbearing, the bitter taste of death almost consuming him. The boy coughed the dust particles that started hovering and flying in the air. He quickly started feeling himself across his body, trying to pinpoint if he was hurt as the adrenaline was drowning his senses. He got some bruises and small cuts all over his body, but it was nothing he couldn't handle. The stabbing pain of broken bones wasn't there, rather just a bone bruise at best. Izuku hissed as he forced himself to stand, quickly hurrying to take shelter before his unknown enemy started to shoot again. He found shelter behind some rubble and felt the cool stone pressed against his back, sliding down into a sitting position. His heart was beating so hard he could barely hear if anyone was coming. This was different. He wasn't home anymore where he would always get treatment for his wounds, have a bed to return to after a tough day or week, have meals, food, water to keep him in shape. And as reality started to set in, Izuku felt the bitter aftertaste of fear set in with it. Izuku now. The male stood on top of the rubble, staring out on the destruction of his making. He looked over the once tall city, its buildings stretching on for miles and roads that had been meanders around the city. Its maze-like structure he had familiarized himself with over the last years. The young boy sighed, picking up a petal and lightly tossing it in the air. His mission was done, he had completed his objective. Now he just needed to give the world a hint to who he was. Izuku sighed once again, throwing the petal against a wall, the small impact from the petal enough to make the wall crumble. The young boy placed his hands in his black trainers. A small smile creeped up on his lips. The curl of his lips felt unfamiliar and distant. A single thought graced his mind. He could see his mother again. The boy felt the sweet taste of relief fall on his tongue, excitement and a throbbing in his chest he hadn't recognized in a long time. His heart. Then he felt it, the feeling of being observed. It wasn't the predatory feeling though, as he would get attacked and skinned at any moment. Rather, it was no hostility at all. Izuku whipped his head around, thankful he dyed his hair black before going up to the surface. His black hair danced in the wind, and far, far away Izuku saw him. A man, haggard and tired, hunched over with his binoculars staring right at him. He seemed to be the only one to have noticed his presence, to have acknowledged the moment he had made his presence known. Izuku stared into the binoculars, beyond them and the flickering glint of red before the man dropped his binoculars on the ground. The boy could faintly see how one of his colleagues walked up to him, seemingly asking him something. But the young boy didn't waste any time and slipped down the opening in the ground, promptly shutting it behind him before the man behind the shield could catch a glimpse of him again. He had smelled the fresh scent of rain as well, and he didn't feel his cover blown with the black dye dripping down his shoulders to reveal his forest green locks. Kuro here, over. Demolish the shield. The buzzing sound around him of electricity died down, the sound of the shield shutting off. Part of his consciousness told him it was right in time for the rain. Eraserhead now. The chaos ensured almost immediately, everyone scrambling in the pouring rain to reach the city, to be the first one to start looking over the damage and view the world-known city in its collapsed state. All of them hoping to be the one to find who was responsible, and probably also loot the place. Aizawa swore loudly, getting pushed around by some daytime heroes who tried to get past where the barrier had once been. The man growled, were these people supposed to be pro-heroes? To be military? Wasn't it their purpose to stay organized and calm in panic? The black-haired man shook his head, water drops flying off his drenched hair. The sand beneath him shifted, hardening under the water's droplets. His breath familiar in his lungs. But he knew better than that, and he leaped. Being an underground hero had forced him to see things and witness chaos where heroes usually refused to go. Once again the man scowled before sprinting into the chaos himself. The heroes flooded the city, the military closely monitoring every step and all searching for what was left of the ruined city. Some searched for survivors, most for loot, and the city was full of it. Some found small chunks of gold, other jewels. Some discovered ancient artifacts from the time before quirks, others from a time even long before that. The place was littered with discoveries and loot stolen from all over the world. The ground was littered with body parts and gore. Intestines lay widely spread out over the rubble, some crushed beneath it. The water from the rain ran pink over the desert-like area. The ground sucked up every fiber of liquid it could to fertilize its endless thirst. But there was this feeling in the man's gut, a feeling that said something wasn't quite right. He couldn't pinpoint it. This entire thing felt wrong. No, it screamed wrong. The loot, the bodies, the amount of it all was that threw him off. It was littered with it. But was it enough? The man leaped from stone to stone, swift movements closing into the place he had seen the figure. His mind was still racing, but he pushed it back into the back of his mind. Everything else seemed unnecessary. He had seen a survivor. Let the rest loot the shit place, he had priorities. His feet danced over the unfamiliar ground. Every step landed with determination and power. He started to move past the rest of the heroes, move past the military and anyone else who had managed to somehow sneak past the high security. Soon, the land around him became untouched by the rescue team. The bodies stood littered between the rubble, blood still pouring from some, while others already had that deathly pale look. Body parts stood alone in some areas, all from arms, legs and feet, to intestines. His muscles felt at ease, and the rain was cooling against his skin. The rocks became slippery, but he used his capture weapon to easily force his body forward. Soon the only sound around him was his own steps and the rain pouring around him. Aizawa landed on a rock, stopping his fluent motion at about where he had seen the figure. He scanned the deserted area, the rubble looking exactly the same as everywhere else. No sign of anything, no whole bodies, no loot, not a single trace that there had ever been a living person there. He activated his quirk, scanning the area for anything or anyone that might be hidden with a quirk. And he hoped, a part of him hoped that someone would be there, to let someone have survived the horrendous massacre. But the logic side of his head told him that wouldn't be the case. His eyes wandered over piece after piece of stone and rubble, scanning it multiple times till his eyes ached. Each time a small glimmer of hope to see someone, something new being brutally shattered. The black-haired man sighed, pinching his nose as he rested on the rock. He had been so sure, so damn sure it had been someone here, yet the trace that could have been was washed away by the rose-colored rain. For a while the male sat there, water dripping from his skin and bones, the water on the ground becoming slightly more transparent as time passed. In the far distance, the light of heroes and military slowly grew closer, but the man estimated it would take them an hour or two before they reached his destination as thoroughly they went through the rubble. So instead he tipped his head to the ground, letting the soothing sound of the rain calm his racing heart. Shota, the name snapped him back to reality, the familiar loud voice creating a comfort that swept around him like a warm blanket. Yamada, his answer was short, but full of relief. His eyes looked up, meeting with the familiar half-broken glasses and a soft yet worried look hiding beneath their shell. You disappeared so quickly I didn't know where you went. His voice was surprisingly soft in contrast to his usual high and energetic shouts. Aizawa took a minute to take in his friend's appearance. He looked so tired. His usually well-kept blonde hair was hanging down in multiple places, dirty and unkempt, the water dripping in various places. He had bags under his eyes. Aizawa hadn't seen that since high school, and they pulled all-nighters to cram before their exams. His glasses were just barely holding on, one socket broken from an earlier explosion and dirt hiding their usual color. His clothes were no better, completely drenched, and he somehow had managed to rip them in multiple places. Aizawa looked straight into his friend's eyes, shoulders slumped and voice on the brink of exhaustion. I saw someone. The three words left the man in front of him speechless, his mouth hanging open as the perfect fly catcher. Aizawa could feel the side of his mouth twitch up, but just an unnoticeable motion to most. But that how? His voice shook the rubble at their feet. His yellow eyes stared into Aizawa's dark ones. For a minute the world felt still, their eyes locking into one another. Yamada's breath hitching before asking, "Are you sure?" The man nodded, knowing his entire body had reacted to the gaze. It wasn't an illusion, he was sure, he was so sure. Yet a part of him screamed it wasn't. He stood here, I think at least. Just before the barrier broke, he stood here, looking over the destruction. Aizawa didn't dare to continue, uncertainty slowly poisoning his words. The feeling of uncertainty continued to drip into his mind, his brain telling him one thing but his gut another. Yamada stood patiently waiting for him to continue, too worried to interrupt or break his train of thoughts. Shota took a deep breath, pushing away the doubt. If he was wrong, so be it, they wouldn't find anything, but if he was right, that would change everything. He seemed to be no older than a teenager, well-built despite of that and semi-long unruly black hair. He had it tied up in a ponytail. Shota took a deep breath before continuing his observation. He had black clothes which weren't too special, but his eyes, Shota couldn't stop the words getting stuck in his throat, his friend looking more and more worried by the second. He opened his mouth again, only to be interrupted by a daytime hero from Germany. He spoke in English, breaking hard in his native language. He was out of breath, but the two heroes from Japan could roughly make out what he said, and it chilled them to their bones. They found a clue to who is behind this shit show. That's it for today, guys. Hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, please leave a like, share, and subscribe. Also check out the author. Link in description.